But I'll play it from there. But yeah, if it all sounds good to you, we can go ahead and get started.
Let's do it.
All right. Nick Norwitz, welcome to the Science and Chill podcast. Thanks for hopping on quite short notice. This is sort of in an ad hoc podcast, I guess, in response to some of the recent social media happenings and some recent publications that you have. So thanks for taking the time for me today to hop on the podcast and chat.
Absolutely. Excited to be here.
Yeah. And so before we get into the topics we have planned for today, can you just give the audience a brief introduction on yourself, maybe talk about your education, what you're currently working on, and where you're studying, and so on and so forth?
Sure. Quick run through. I was born in Newton, Massachusetts. Grew up, have two siblings. I'm the oldest of three, couple dogs, very regular suburban upbringing. I did my undergrad at Dartmouth College in biochemistry and cell biology, then went on to Oxford to do a PhD in human physiology and metabolism, particularly neurometabolism and ketogenics. Now I'm at Harvard Med doing my medical training. My research interests, I really like to dabble in a lot of different things. So I've done a lot of neurometabolism, neurodegenerative disease, GI, osteo, now really into endocrinology, lipidology, that kind of thing. So it's a fun time in my life where I get to explore. I'm also, well, I'll cut it at that. I kind of want to get into the nitty gritty. People can hear my backstory on other channels. And
yeah, sure thing. I always like to refer people when I have guests on who have been on multiple podcasts, and like, let's just cut out kind of all of the, all of the inner kind of sandwich stuff and all the out, those stuff that's maybe relevant, but they can find on other podcasts. And, you have your own YouTube channel, Twitter and stuff. So people can learn kind of all about your background there. And I would recommend them to follow you on all those platforms.
Thanks. So we can I have a 5-minute video on my backstory that's friend made, better talking about me than me. So if I say stuff here that you find interesting, then you can check that out. If not, you can cut me out of your brain forever.
Sounds good. So yeah, as you mentioned, you have a broad interest in a lot of things, which I find great. And, being a medical student, it's great that you also have kind of that broad interest. And metabolism has been sort of one of your interest, and you're always talking about the latest research in metabolism, and now, getting into doing your own research in metabolism and medical education and things like that. And sort of that brings us to the reason for hopping on and doing a podcast today. You recently published a paper on the use of continuous glucose monitoring. It was a pilot project in medical students, kind of a proof of concept study, and it's getting a lot of attention, which is great. So congratulations on that. Getting a lot of attention, both good and bad. I would say, from what I've seen, more good. Maybe it's just the side of Twitter that I'm, on and looking at, but good reception from the paper in terms of people, saying this is great application of this interesting technology. Also, some maybe not necessarily negative attention, but some criticisms about, the applicability of the study and so on. And we can definitely talk about that. So before we get into actually talking about the paper, though, I would love to talk about the technology and the concepts of continuous glucose monitoring. Many people may have heard of this sort of technology. It's a technology that's been used for people and in people with diabetes for a long time to monitor their blood glucose. But why don't you give people a brief background on what CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, is before we kind of get deeper?
Sure. I mean, the name is pretty self-explanatory. It measures your glucose continuously over the course of a day. It's not actually blood glucose, it's interstitial glucose, but basically a little patch, you put it on your arm or your abdomen, and you can hook it up to an app on your phone. There are lots of different CGMs. The one we used was Dexcom G6, and you get your glucose readings over the course of a day, which has relevance for metabolic conditions, particularly diabetes, because that's a disease of, high degrees of glycemic variability, either because you don't make your own insulin if you have type 1 diabetes, or because you're severely insulin resistant, as in type 2 diabetes. So that can have medical applications because it allows you to, adjust your diet, activities, medications, and generally allows people to achieve better glycemic control and avoid the need to stick their finger multiple times a day. More recently, it's been used by healthy users via direct-to-consumer platforms. And this is where a lot of the controversy seems to be arising. Now, it's funny, my impression, I don't know how long you've been on Twitter. My impression was like a couple of years ago, there was a big explosion when a certain very popular podcaster who is not to be named, I guess I don't want to bring the ire down on him again, but made a blog about CGMs, and then somebody else like attacked him for it, and it started this huge war. I've been told about this retrospectively because this preceded me, but I think it primed a lot of the discussion that I inadvertently like poked the bear with
Yeah,
this.
I think,
because
I mean, I think it was, I don't think it's probably not us mentioning the name. Was it Tim Ferriss? I'm just taking a guess, but was it
I
him?
thought it was Peter Attia.
Oh, it might have been Peter Attia too. But I do, so just going maybe even back further in the timeline, I almost feel like I had heard about Tim Ferriss talking about this like 4 or 5 years ago, when he was like, because, you know, him being sort of in the tech Silicon Valley world, like he was at one point talking about how he was able to get access to one of these when you like really needed a prescription for it. But
Yeah.
I know Attia has also talked about his use of it, but I don't think we're throwing anybody under the bus by mentioning that. They're pretty open about their use of it. So
Probably. I try to be careful about those things, but
of course.
yeah, it really exploded. I think, my perspective on it, I think it's fantastic. I think, any tool can be abused, but it has so much applicability to healthy people for inspiring them to engage in lifestyle change, because you get continuous biofeedback from the CGM. You can see in real time how things affect your blood sugar, and then reflect on, as students did in our study, how glycemic variations actually affect the way you're feeling. So for example, we had students saying, like my impression when I was having like an energy low that I was hypoglycemic, but I found that's not the case. And I'm actually most energized and focused and highest performing. My blood sugar is stable between 70 and 90. So, it gets people excited and thinking about the metabolism, and motivates them in a way that often, not always, but I think often is not pathological. Because, glycemic variation at this point doesn't have the same like stigma as weight. So I think, what I've seen is it gets people excited, focusing on a, operationalizable variable that's kind of like new and exciting, and allows people a tool to see into their metabolism, just one aspect of the metabolism. And we can talk about that limitation in a minute, but so that they're motivated to like start to experiment and actually take charge of their nutrition. And lifestyle.
And so we'll certainly talk about, some of the criticisms later, but I think that maybe I think probably the main criticism at this point is, and this is for the use of, I think we should mention that kind of going forward, we're talking about using CGMs in healthy individuals, not, individuals with diabetes. But one of the main criticisms is like, do these glycemic variations matter in healthy individuals who are insulin sensitive? Like, there are pathophysiological, variations in glucose, these glucose spikes, quote unquote. I guess the argument is that these necessarily aren't as important physiologically or from a kind of disease perspective in healthy individuals, because yes, your glucose is going to maybe increase after a meal, but since you're insulin sensitive, the glucose is going to come back down. So these are just normal kind of variations. So what would be maybe your response to that? And are there any kind of data showing that even in healthy individuals, maybe these glycemic excursions throughout the day, it's best to limit those and have kind of a more stable blood glucose response?
Yeah. Well, my like high level response is that any tool can be abused. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use the tool. It means you should educate people on how to use the tool properly. So like, for example, if you don't know how to use a hammer and you go to use a hammer for the first time, or you give it to a baby and they're trying to hammer a nail, they keep hitting their finger, take the hammer away until you teach them how to use the hammer. It's the same way with CGMs. It's like, do I think you should just give CGMs out like candy to the lay public? Absolutely not, because there is then a higher chance of over pathologizing glycemic excursions and having people think, oh, I need to avoid anything that causes glycemic variability. Whereas if you train people properly on these tools, like we did with these students, and give these students some credit, I mean, they're Harvard medical students, they're relatively sharp. If you talk about like what causes glycemic variability and how to interpret those causes, so things like exercise cause glycemic excursions, cortisol awakening response, stress, and then you can interpret the data in the clinical context, which is what our medical students are doing, and what I think lay people can do as well. Give people credit; they're pretty smart. And so, if you provide proper training, this can become a very powerful tool, because people's responses are highly individualized. There's a lot of data showing that you take even healthy people and they eat just out in the world, whatever foods they're going to eat, people will have very different responses to the exact same food. Mm-hmm. And this can actually be predicted using machine learning based on your microbiome fingerprint. But for example, one person might have a very strong glycemic response to pineapple, and another person very strong glycemic response to mango. And then you feed pineapple and mango to the opposite participants, and they actually have much more stable glycemic responses, which is interesting. And I think you need to integrate that with how the person feels based on their glycemic variation. So are there long-term outcome data showing that if I gave a healthy person a CGM, they're less likely to develop diabetes? Well, those studies have not been investigated. Right now, there's no will to do that. So absolutely not. But that doesn't mean that these aren't potentially valuable tools if people are reporting it's valuable. So if you give this to someone and they're like, I'm personally noticing that this is a valuable tool for me, it gets me more engaged about my nutrition. I find that, if I try to stabilize my blood sugar by eating this way and not that way, without necessarily, if this isn't your goal, cutting out all fruits and vegetables, which I think is something people are already afraid of for whatever reason. But, if you think that a little glucose bump from broccoli is a problem, then we have, a discussion to have. Then, yeah, in that sense, I think it would be valuable if somebody's saying, I feel better when I X, and I found this out because I used a CGM. What's problematic with that? You just have to advise people on how to interpret if they're having issues, which I don't think most people are. I saw a tweet today, you saw the same one, where somebody was saying now people aren't exercising because their CGMs are telling them their glucose is going up.
Right.
I want to, reply to that like, okay, who? Citation needed. Please tell me who this person is, because I haven't seen that. Certainly this didn't happen in our study where people were, if anything, exercising a lot more.
Yeah, I think, again, the hyperbole behind that tweet, just in other tweets in general, but I think that was, I would, assume that they probably just kind of made that up on the spot, not necessarily in reference to anybody, because like you said, I mean, the normal person, I would find it hard to believe if somebody was going to become so hyper-focused on glucose that they avoided anything, not even just foods, but anything that would raise their blood glucose. That seems, it seems hard to believe. So I know the tweet that you're referring to though, but I do agree that the educational component is certainly necessary if people are going to be using this technology, but it's just like anything. And what I've been thinking about over the past, week or so, when the CGM kind of discussion has been happening, is that I don't really find it much different than any of the other tools that we have right now that are measuring like our biometric data, that you have to learn how to use them and what to do with the data for it to be valuable. And it's not necessarily bad. I mean, for instance, like an Oura ring, people are using their Oura rings. You can see, I think one of the more valuable things with Oura rings is, say, noticing how does, say, if I eat X or if I have a couple of drinks before bed, how does that affect my sleep? I can draw, I think there's a parallel between that and, say, how does this food affect my blood glucose? So if I find that I eat something before bed and it maybe knocks off my sleep metrics, I don't have as much deep sleep, or my heart rate's elevated during sleep, you could just as easily kind of pathologize that. But again, if you know what that data means and you then know how to kind of take the actions to prevent that, it can lead to good outcomes. But we have just as little data on whether Oura rings or your Apple Watch and your resting heart rate metrics, whether those are leading to any better long-term outcomes either. I would argue that they're probably not, because most people don't know how to sort of use them or integrate them, and they're just looking at their data. But, just having an Oura ring help me sleep better, who knows? And same thing with like a CGM, does using that help people reduce their risk of diabetes? I'm not quite sure. But then you don't see people criticizing the use of Oura rings. Maybe some people do, because they're saying, it's, again, placing a hyper focus on sleep or whatever it is. But I just don't see the same backlash between consumer technology regarding sleep, blood pressure, et cetera, that I do with CGM. So I kind of find that aspect interesting as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't get in the mind of the anti-CGMers that well. It doesn't really resonate with me.
Right.
So, we can talk about particular criticisms further, but yeah, I think we like, all tools can be abused. I think you put that tweet up or something like that. Somebody said something about all tools can be abused, and you just need proper training. So we try to take our due diligence in this study, and yeah, I think if we want to dig into it a little bit more, the motivation behind it was not trying to get medical students to focus more on their health per se. It was
can you just name the title of the paper quickly, and then we can kind of get into it? You know, the title of the paper you published, just in case people want to find it. I'll put a link in the show notes, but
it was Metabolic Health Immersion for Medical Education, a pilot program with continuous glucose monitors in medical and dental students.
Okay, awesome.
So this was really a one of the things that was exciting about it was a grassroots student-inspired, student-designed, student-led project. It started in the fall when, you know, we were learning some, you know, basic human metabolism, and a group of students were kind of inquiring about doing a little bit more, learning more about their metabolism. And it occurred to me, and I kind of was floating the idea around that, you know, what's one way we can engage people with metabolism? Because it's really difficult right now with medical schools to find time and space to talk about nutrition. There's next to no time devoted in the curriculum. There is a will, or like a desire, to incorporate more nutrition education. There was actually in May, was it the McGovern Commission or something like that, a call basically by Congress to incorporate nutrition into medical education, but not much has been done. And I think one of the problems is it's kind of like a zero-sum game, right? There's more and more medical information for students to learn in less and less time. In fact, our preclinical time has now been cut from 2 years to 13 months. They compress it. So like there's so much to learn, and you put more of one thing in, you have to take out something else. And so it's really hard to prioritize things. It becomes a zero-sum game. And so my thought was, you know, nutrition is something we kind of engage in already every single day by virtue of being human, eating. It's also very individual. So what if we are allowing people to, or motivating people to engage with nutrition outside the classroom via the use of CGMs? It's a creative way to add nutrition education in a very personalized way without saying, okay, we have to restructure the whole curriculum, and something that I actually potentially could make happen. So I put together a group of students who was really interested. The faculty were surprisingly extremely excited about it. Maybe not surprisingly, I have to give them more credit, and supported, you know, sailing through the approval IRB process. So we went through all the right routes, and had some great partnerships with clinicians. Rob Sives was our study physician, so he did all like the safety screenings and stuff. And then Dexcom, we had some reps that were very nice for this project. We're very motivated to give us CGMs because they, you know, were very excited about the concept, for obvious reasons, of students becoming literate with the use of CGMs. In particular, I just do want to give out a shout out to a friend of mine, Hubie. He's a rep at Dexcom that I was working with. He has type 1, so that's why he, you know, is really, this technology changed his life. And what he kept on telling me, which is one of the motivating factors throughout, is like that it matters a lot to him and people like him that future doctors are trained in this technology, because it really can change lives. And we actually saw that throughout the course of our study. I'll get into that in a bit. But so we got the CGMs. The initial enrollment was 13 students. I didn't know how popular it would be. It was very popular. Like within the first week, we had CGMs on people, and it started, you know, rumors going around like, what's that on your arm? And people are showing off their data, and people get really excited.
The word spread,
tons more requests for more CGMs, and got a few more. So we were able to expand eventually to like 40 students with CGMs. We got a lot more requests, but just couldn't fill them for the pilot. And in the end, students just reported a really, really positive experience overall with the monitors. There were 100% of respondents. We put out a survey and had qualitative and quantitative responses, but 100% said it was valuable, give them valuable insights into their body's own reactions to food, was valuable to their medical education, and will help them better serve their patients. And then about 2/3 were encouraged to change their eating strategies. There were a lot of cool quotes, which we can go into in a minute, and we provide in the paper. But overall, I think the finding was that like students were just, it got them excited about nutrition in a way that I really haven't seen before. And I think that was really inspiring for me and inspiring for faculty. I had faculty approaching me just saying, look, this is great. We love students just getting excited about medicine and being able to help patients. So, I mean, that's the takeaway. It's not trying to convert anybody to anything. It's just getting people to look at and think about how metabolism impacts health, their health, and the health of the patients. So,
No, and
yeah,
I think,
go ahead.
yeah, I think that that's one of the main things to note. And again, going back to sort of like, what was the reason for you all designing this trial? It wasn't to slap on CGMs to, you know, 20 to 25-year-olds with healthy metabolisms to like have them get the ability to see how food impacts their metabolism. Like, sure, that was kind of a nice secondary outcome, because a lot of, you know, individuals who are our age, you know, probably aren't as, you know, aware. They aren't as aware of metabolism and, you know, how foods and affect their body, and they just haven't been thinking of that. But the overall kind of concept, you know, that was just the side sort of effect of it. And the overall thing was to teach them that metabolism impacts health. And so they can think about this in the broader context of the patients that they're treating, which is insanely important, because going back to the limited nutrition education that doctors kind of receive, and this is just adding to those hours, you know, it really opens your eyes. And then I think them gaining interest in, and maybe you have some specific quotes for this, but them gaining interest in seeing how their metabolism is affected by what they're eating, how their lifestyle is affecting their blood glucose, is probably going to spur them on to dive deeper into nutrition. Maybe they get into podcasts, maybe they start reading books on nutrition. And so this, in a way, it's going to second-handedly like increase their own interest in metabolism, and then, you know, motivate them to educate themselves on all these topics. That's what I would imagine, I guess, from it. And I'm sure that you have had that type of feedback as well.
Exactly. I mean, this was, you know, the CGMs were a catalyst. We were doing other things at the same time. So people were getting engaged in nutrition. So we had like a journal club, you know, so juxtaposed to seeing the CGM data coming from your arm onto your iPhone, we're reading like, you know, the primary literature in Cell. Keep in mind, this is in addition to having all our preps and coursework and clinical work. Right. But we're sitting down and reading like 2015 Zevi et al. In Cell, which actually, incidentally, same author group that just came out with the sweetener article that we were talking about before. Yeah. Before we jump on the pod, so we can talk a little bit about that. But that, for example, was a phenomenal paper in Cell. The title was, I think, Personalized Nutrition by Prediction of Glycemic Responses. It was ZEEVI, I think it all, Cell 2015. But basically what they showed is...
read that paper, yeah.
It's a very popular paper by this group, the Segal group from the Weizmann Institute in Israel, who do fantastic work. But basically what they were showing is that, yeah, like I said before, huge variations within individuals to the same foods. So you can't necessarily predict what will make your, you know, glucose go up and down, or that things might have more complex effects. So, you know, we're talking about like over pathologizing glycemic variability, where there's like data in this paper showing, you know, you eat fiber over the short term, it actually increases your glycemic response, but over the long term, it tends to decrease it. So like, you know, you can think about that data critically when you're then interpreting the data coming from your personal CGM. So like you said, it was inspiring students to get excited about delving into the primary literature and thinking about things more critically as they interacted with our coursework, because at the same time we're studying diabetes in class, we're meeting with patients in clinic with diabetes, and we're just being exposed consistently by virtue of being humans in the medical system to the standard advice around nutrition and the food environment we're in, and kind of thinking about it consistently. So people became kind of like, I would say, like metabolically woke. Like these things around us, like, you know, does it make sense that we're feeding this patient with diabetes, this inpatient with a fasting blood sugar of 217 chocolate cake? Probably not. Like there's no question that's dysfunctional, but you don't see it, you don't think about it until you have access to this technology, and then you can't unsee it. And you can't unsee that, like, that's an important point. When you go to lunch, all the crap, the fact that there's like, or for breakfast, pizza for breakfast, and not just like actual real eggs in a hospital cafeteria, and see what patients are being fed. And you then actually can question like the social norms around food and medicine, and, you know, then actually kind of shine the spotlight where it deserves to be shown.
Yeah, I like the the wording that you used, it kind of makes you like woke to, nutrition, and like you can't unsee it, because it's so true that, I'm not a medical student, but just knowing, hearing from people in the medical establishment, and it just seems like it's kind of just people don't really think twice about, you give them I'm going to give this person the standard hospital fare because that's what has been done and that's what always been done, and you don't really think about the patient's situation, or whether they should be eating this chocolate cake or taking their medicines with like orange juice or something like that. So definitely an important part of that. And I think the individualized responses too is something important to talk about just in general with the CGM, because a lot of times with dietary advice, and everybody can see this, I just think with the kind of carb phobia maybe on Twitter sometimes, or maybe even like the fruit phobia, or people will say, don't eat fruit because it spikes your glucose, or don't eat X food, replace X with any one of your favorite foods. Well, yeah, so one person, they may not be able to eat grapes, say for instance. Grapes might just cause an insane spike in glucose and they should stay away from that. But that's not to say grapes for everyone are unhealthy. Nobody should eat grapes. It's how do grapes affect me? Maybe I tolerate grapes fine, or maybe I don't tolerate oranges fine. So this kind of seeing the personalized aspect, not only can that help the individual, so in this case, say the medical students who are wearing the monitors, but then I think, you can also begin to think about just the individual patients, and not that every patient's going to respond differently to whatever diet we give them based on their individual scenario. And like, unfortunately, you can't necessarily predict how somebody's going to respond to a food if you're treating them in the hospital, but just the eye-opening effects of that, I think, are important to see the individual variability and not treating everybody as this sort of physiological system that responds similarly across everyone. Everyone's going to have a different metabolic response to anything that they eat. So I think that's kind of an important aspect of this nutritional education immersion thing as well.
Yeah, it's about information. Like with any medication, for example, you provide people the pros and cons and then let them make their decision. The CGM does that with food effectively. How does this affect your glycemic variability? How does it affect the way that you feel? And then make your decision based on it. I'm not trying to steer people away, especially from any whole foods, but there's obviously a distinction, and you can see this arise on CGM, between a young 20-something like yourself who's a highly active person having some grapes, and someone who is struggling with obesity and type 1 diabetes being told that fruit is healthy, and then finding out, oh, you know what? Blueberries have a lot smaller impact on my glucose and end up, getting me better numbers than grapes. And I like blueberries just fine, so then I'll have the blueberries,
Yeah. And so what about, I think another important aspect, and you can talk about what some of the responses with the medical students were in this, is not only, using these glucose readings from the CGM to inform what to eat, and maybe on the other hand, what not to eat, but also correlating what your glucose levels are to just how you feel in general. Like, this doesn't even have to deal with food, but just throughout the day, you could take a look at your CGM chart and say, what time of the day did I exercise? When did I have my sort of dip in energies in the afternoon? And like correlating those glucose numbers with subjective feelings, that can be important as well, because sometimes, a common thing that you'll hear people say, oh, my energy is so low right now, man, I'm like hypoglycemic. Well, are you? Let's take a look at your CGM. Maybe your glucose is 100. You're not hypoglycemic, but you're still having this drop in energy during the day. So that can sort of get you thinking about, oh, what else could be causing this lull in energy? I'm not having a glucose dip, so maybe it's not even related to anything I ate. And so you can sort of, by process of elimination, notice how things in your daily life are affecting your energy levels. When your glucose is up, how do you feel? When your glucose is down, how do you feel? When do you feel the best? At what glucose level do you feel the best? And then you can sort of work to like target those numbers. So I think that could be an interesting aspect as well. This doesn't always have to just be about, food. Obviously, food is the main thing that gets talked about, I guess, when we talk about CGMs, but stress can influence glucose, exercise can influence glucose. So do you have anything to say about that in terms of maybe what some of the students involved in this project had to say about correlating their glucose numbers, excursions with their feelings and moods and so on?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that was something that we saw repeated, reported quite commonly. We included some quotes in the paper. people saying I feel like more focused when my blood sugar is like stable between 70 and 90. I was surprised to find like, that when I thought I was hypoglycemic, I was actually hyperglycemic,
Mm-hmm.
and that I would be, in the morning, I thought I was hypo, so I'd need to try to eat food, but that would just put me on a glucose roller coaster. And then I'd actually feel like worse over the course of the day. And I found that, when I ate this way instead of that way, or even fasted in the morning, I ended up feeling a lot better over the long term. People also reported that finding that, when they were having poor sleep, that really affected their glycemic variability and response to food. So people, when they were getting poor sleep, had worse excursions in response to sugars, and that actually motivated them to get more sleep. And as a knock-on effect, and for other reasons, they were exercising more. Students were just generally reporting better health habits. I think that's pretty common when you get one element of health in line, be it sleep, exercise, or food. I think other things tend to roll with it. And so we were finding, I think on the whole, people taking care of themselves, feeling more motivated to take care of themselves. Now, that didn't mean they didn't have like a waffle every now and then on Waffle Thursdays or anything. Don't underestimate the power of cheap free food for medical students. But it did make people very conscious and just, like I said, made them metabolically woke so they can make informed decisions in any given moment. So, when there were the waffles, students were asking themselves like, is it worth it right now? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. But then you can actually stop not making an impulsive choice and think, pros and cons. Is this something I want right now for me? So yeah, I was really actually surprised the degree to which people became reflective on what they were eating.
Were there any responses? Were there any responses or any comments about them maybe being concerned that they were maybe this causing them to be hyper focused on their glucose throughout the day? Did you notice anything about that?
That's funny because it was actually when we were talking about the ethics of it and putting in the IRB, and I was talking with the student group, that was a concern. We're like, maybe this will make people are like, I find food a real pleasure, and I think this might steal that away from me. But in the outtake forums, there was none of that. Nobody was reporting that, and people were actually reporting kind of more engagement with their nutrition. So that was actually a surprise to me. I thought at least a few people would be like, I didn't enjoy it because it got me over focused on food. We didn't really hear that in the outtake. It doesn't mean it's not possible. And quite honestly, if you're a healthy person and you're having that response, then a CGM probably isn't for you. I mean, like you were talking about Oura rings earlier. I think wearing an Oura ring would stress me out to the point that it's going to impair my sleep, so I don't wear an Oura ring. So you have to know yourself. But as a straightforward answer, no, I didn't really get those responses in the outtake forums. And I was specifically looking for it.
Yeah, for sure, which I think is good because obviously, you were looking for some of the positive aspects of this, but again, it's also good to look at, what can be some of the downsides of these. Just because speaking personally, and my wife and I were talking about, I was talking to her about CGM the other day. She doesn't care, but I think it's interesting. But I was telling her, I think for myself, so I have an Oura ring, and contrary to kind of what you said, I don't find that it stresses me out. I kind of find it just more interesting to sometimes look at the sleep data. With a CGM, I have a glucose monitor at home that I'll sometimes use and a ketone monitor. But with a CGM, just knowing myself, I absolutely know that I would become hyper-focused throughout the day, and it would steal kind of all of my attention throughout the day, and I would be looking at these numbers all day long. So for me, and just knowing the type of person that I am, I would probably steer myself away from ever using one of these because it would just create this sort of environment that was unhealthy, because everything I ate, I would then take a look at my CGM. Everything I took a sip of, I would look at my CGM. And again, it's like you said, it depends on the individual and whether they think it's a tool that they can use or whether it's going to be maybe not necessarily abused, but just sort of create kind of these negative outcomes.
100%. There's a difference between saying this technology should be available and saying everybody needs to use this technology.
Right. Should be ubiquitous. Right.
So I just think it's a cool thing to like have out there, and students are calling for it. Now residents are calling for it. And there's actually a lot of call for expansion of this project. So, that's what we're kind of thinking about next is where is this going to go? Because this was a baby pilot project. I know it's getting talked about a lot, but in terms of what we did, like it's a pretty minor paper. It's just a unique paper, and obviously it has some provocative elements, Harvard Medical School and et cetera, et cetera. So, it was primed to get a poke, but I don't want to like make this out to be more than it was. it was kind of like testing the water to see, is there will to go forward with, quote, metabolic immersion education. And it seems interesting. And so the next thing I really want to do is do a multimodal expansion. What I mean by that, I can talk about 3 dimensions.
Sure.
One dimension, expanding horizontally, so more medical schools. I've already gotten invites from a couple to speak about this because there are students there that have heard about this and like, well, we want that. A vertical expansion, by which I mean not just medical students, but residents and even attendings, who I think would really benefit from this and would love to get involved. And it would also create a sense of community across the levels, because then people could engage with their residents and their attendings all about, learning together about their glycemic variation. And I think everybody can learn from these tools. And so it's something that could benefit all groups. And just as an aside on that community aspect, that was one of the bits of feedback that was the strongest when I was asking, what you liked about this project, what maybe could be improved. People were like, my favorite part was community. To wear a CGM by myself might have been a little isolating, but it was really cool to do it with my friends and be able to say this is my response to this, and this is your response to that, and just talk about it. People really love the community aspect of it, which really excited me. And then the third dimension would be more wearables. So not just glucose, which is, a limitation of some of the technology we have, but other wearables, things like Oura rings, and we were talking about this right before we got in the pod. Coincidentally, there was just a paper out in Nature Biomedical Engineering. The title is A Wearable Electrochemical Biosensor for the Monitoring of Metabolites and Nutrients, which is, as of now, the first multi-metabolite continuous monitor. I don't know when it's going to hit the market, but it's phenomenally exciting in terms of concept. What it is it actually measures nutrients, various vitamins and minerals and metabolites in human sweat. But it can actually do it at rest and during exercise by calibrating to the sodium and the body temperature. I have the paper here. I'll read an excerpt on the technology. It says, in this article, we present a universal wearable biosensing strategy based on a judicious combination of the mass-producible laser-engraved graphene, electrochemically synthesized redox active nanoreporters, and molecularly imprinted polymer-based artificial antibodies, as well as unique in situ regeneration and calibration technologies. I don't really understand the technology. I did do a video that we can link to it, but it's one of those things where, a criticism of CGM technology is you're not looking at all of metabolism, you're looking at one marker. And it's like, okay, that's true, but that's because that's the technology we have. When we have continuous multi-metabolite monitors, we'll use those. And I was kind of thinking, this is going to be years and years and years away. And then a paper comes out 2 days later saying, no, you know what? It actually might be here. So
that's exciting. That's exciting stuff. I think that I saw someone a while ago post, I don't know if they were taking part in a project with one of these, but it was some sort of basically tattoo type thing that they had, I assume that's the laser engraving technology or whatever, but some sort of tattoo that's sort of maybe right on the skin or just below the skin that's sort of doing these measurements. I'm not quite sure whether that was the same concept or not, but I mean, this is fascinating technology and very important. Like you said, I mean, I assume the ability to measure what vitamins and minerals, ketones, I would assume, maybe blood glucose, lactate, things like that.
Yeah. Well,
I'll have to give
kind of already available.
I said I'll have to give the paper a read.
Yeah. I posted a video about it on Twitter, as well as the link, and I can send you the paper as well. But the applications of this are so far-reaching for research and for clinical medicine. So, for example, they mentioned in the paper, this could be used to screen for metabolic syndrome based on branched-chain amino acid levels in the serum, even COVID, because COVID positive and COVID negative people have different, say, leucine variations. So you could use this to screen for infectious, non-infectious disease, even use it for, measures of fatigue. So one of the things they reported in this paper is the tryptophan, which is a large neutral amino acid, to the branched chain amino acid ratio changes during exercise and correlates with fatigue. So you might be able to objectively measure fatigue in athletes as a measure of the tryptophan to BCAA ratio. And that could be sensed by the sensor in your arm and read out to your phone. So then when you're working out, you're like, I'm trying to get to this tryp to BCAA, ratio, and that's when I'm going to cut my workout or something like that. It's just it's super cool technology.
Yeah, the applications are kind of endless too. I mean, with COVID, you're just thinking about that. So you don't have to wait till symptoms develop to sort of go in and take a test. Your monitor could maybe screen you early, say, oh, these sort of ratios or these certain biomarkers are correlated to COVID-19. So maybe you should go get tested. Sends an alert to your phone. Let's go get tested. Or say somebody with heart disease, maybe if this thing could measure something like cardiac troponin T. Oh, maybe you had a heart attack and you didn't know it, or some biomarker is elevated that's signaling that maybe you're at risk for a heart attack in the near future. So maybe you should go into your doctor now and kind of get checked in before something like that happens. The applications are kind of limitless with that type of technology.
Basically anything that can be detected in human sweat, I think you can adjust it to. That's what they were saying. Mm-hmm. So like, you have a patient with bipolar disorder who's on lithium. That is a very narrow therapeutic window that can be affected by a whole bunch of different things. So you could actually, be kind of monitoring for lithium toxicity. And if a patient has a certain, fingerprint at a particular point in time, their doctor could get pinged on their phone and like, watch out for this patient. They're at home and they might be at risk of lithium toxicity at this point in time. And you don't know, maybe they took a medication that affected kidney function and lithium levels. Like this, like you said, and I said, it has a ton of really cool applications. So that really is the next evolution, maybe 2 steps in the next evolution of things like CGMs. But in terms of what's available to students now, it's CGMs. So
yeah, and I assume that the continuous metabolite monitoring, I'm sure that it will kind of like a lot of technologies take root first in maybe clinical practice, and then it'll move its way to, like we were just mentioning, athletes, where the applications are sort of awesome too, just measuring say hydration levels or fatigue. That's super cool. So you can imagine that this is sort of I can imagine being the next frontier of like, because when you think of performance, it's like, maybe I say you as the general kind of you, but just like thinking about what are the next steps. I'm sure you're aware of like the super shoot controversy. It's like, that's our next step. Our technology is taking us above and beyond what we could have ever done with performance. I think we know so much about nutrition now that it's like we've almost hit the limit in terms of like nutrition for athletic performance. So now maybe it's like, who can monitor and sort of maintain homeostasis the best during competition is now who's going to win. So like, that's kind of where this application could potentially be with athletes. If you're able to control your glucose and your metabolite levels and your sodium concentrations precisely, that could be the difference between now winning and losing. And it might be necessary now to monitor those types of things.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it develops. I don't know if it'll go clinical first before performance. You never know with these things. Sometimes things actually go the DTC route, direct to consumer, before going medical, just because of approval processes. So for example, for like the ketone ester that the lab I was in at Oxford developed, a lot of the funding came initially from DARPA and was used for military purposes, and then is going to be used more for like high-end athletics. Like Tour de France cyclists use it the past few years before going the medical route, just because of financial incentives and the ease of approvals. When I say financial incentives, I want to clarify, I get zero money for any of this.
Right.
So I'm not biased by that, but it's what's applicable. So I don't know if this will go clinical first. I think it's more beneficial for patients potentially. And right now it'll be very hard for the average person to interpret, but like coaches and professional athletes, you never know. And the technology is by no means like, it's risk reward, right? There's nothing dangerous implicitly about this. Could in theory you give this kind of technology or a CGM to a lay person and they're like, oh, now I don't want to eat bananas and instead I'm going to eat a ton of bacon and that gives me a heart attack? Well, first of all, I don't necessarily think bacon causes a heart attack. But could that happen? Yes, but like, it's not like a drug that's going to poison you acutely. So the risk for these kind of technologies is pretty low on the whole. Anyway.
Yeah, so I guess kind of we can maybe talk about some of like going back to the paper with CGM, sort of some of like the criticisms that have come up on Twitter, and I've kind of seen these and tried to take note of them as I was like preparing for our podcast. But I'm sure there are some that I've missed. But one of the main ones I think, and you sort of just talked about it, is people pathologizing certain healthy foods and maybe eliminating them. So do you think that's the risk? You already sort of touched upon that. Maybe it's not based on some of the responses that you got, but again, with the caveat, not everyone who's going to be using these are going to be, younger medical students. So maybe, different types of people are going to be using this technology. So say somebody comes to you and says, Nick, this is going to, I'll just reiterate what you just said. Somebody's going to cut out blueberries and broccoli from their diet, and they're just going to start eating butter and bacon because that's what keeps my glucose nice and steady. What would your response to that be? Do you see that as an inherent risk of this technology?
In a word, yes. But what I want to really emphasize here is that a lot of this discussion has spun out of the paper. And so the criticisms implicitly in some way link back to the paper and have implications for it. And so for the lay public, that's a very different group than a group of Harvard medical students who have been trained on this technology. And in our protocol, we describe, look, we have training on interpretation, the fact that the cortisol awakening response, exercise, and quote, healthy whole foods can cause glycemic excursions. And this is not necessarily an unhealthy thing. We're reading primary literature on, in Cell on how these things affect the glycemic response and what that actually means. So in our study, as far as I know, students were not over pathologizing. Students were not cutting out fruits and vegetables from their diet. In fact, I think we had 3 vegetarians and one vegan. I will say the vegan did cut down on tropical fruit because he made it, he felt better not eating mango, banana, and pineapple and better eating the blueberries. But like nobody was like, I'm not going to eat broccoli.
Right.
So we didn't see that at all. Now, could you see that in the lay population? I think yes. And I think people need to be educated on the proper interpretation of glycemic variability. So you need to reach out to people and provide them with tools. And if they're having that interpretation, kind of like approach them in a way that doesn't make them retract or, become defensive, but be like, here's how maybe you could interpret this. And what I find on Twitter is there's increasing polarization because instead of reaching out to people, people make fun of them. Mm-hmm. I saw a tweet, I think you know the one I'm referring to, where there was a doctor doing just that, saying something like, you should know that like pizza, bagels, and French fries are unhealthy, and that, you shouldn't need a CGM to tell you like,
right.
corn emoji, strawberries are healthy. And I'm like, you know what? If this motivates people to look into that, don't tease them. And if somebody is having a response to a strawberry and then it's like, I don't want to eat strawberries, I want to eat lots of butter instead, have a discussion with them as their physician about maybe why that might not be the greatest idea. But that's such a hyperbolic example. I haven't actually seen that. I do see people making weird claims on Twitter. Usually they're not CGM users. I think there's just a lot of polarization where people like, and I get not trolled, but like attacked on this all the time. Or like I'll post a picture of what I'm eating and somebody will be like, that half a beet has sugar and you're like poisoning yourself. I'm like, no, dude, like,
yeah,
those,
well, that goes back to just if you had a CGM and then you could just show them, look, this little half a beet that I had didn't even cause a little, blip in my blood glucose, right? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a possibility that people can have that response. I think it's very unlikely. I think the examples I've seen are very hyperbolic, and quite honestly, anybody who's going to have that response is probably primed by social media already to be skewed towards the bacon, butter, and eggs type of diet, which quite honestly, some people report that helps them lose a ton of weight. I'm not going to, judge on whether or not this is healthy or unhealthy. That's not my place to do right now. I think people are doing it anyway, is what I'm saying. And my impression is the CGMs, I have not seen a single case of people, actually becoming afraid of a strawberry or afraid of, in the one case we saw, exercise because of a CGM. If you want to point me to someone who's actually saying that, I will go on a case-by-case basis and explain to them why it's not a problem, but I literally have not seen it.
No, nor have I. And I was actually joking on someone with a couple of people on Twitter the other day about, the CGM, and I'm like, oh, well, exercise and waking up spike my blood glucose, so I've stopped doing both. I'm just gonna sleep all the time and not do anything. So, but I second that, Nick. I don't think that I have yet to see anybody or hear anybody who's saying, oh, I'm gonna cut out I'm going to go from eating all these healthy whole foods to eating, butter and bacon because it keeps my glucose levels low. I think, like you said, the people who are eating a lot more, maybe bacon, saturated fat type stuff, higher saturated fat keto, are already doing that. And they're not coming from one extreme to the next just because of this technology. So that criticism, I do think, is a little bit unfounded. The second one, again, then kind of criticism that you mentioned, why do I need a CGM to tell me to sleep well, to exercise, to not eat all of these foods? What foods are healthy and what foods aren't? Again, I also don't really see a lot of merit in that. And back to like not the teasing or shaming type of thing, but again, maybe some people do need a CGM to tell them that these foods are bad and these foods are good. I mean, we talk a lot about, we're in this narrow little sphere on Twitter where everybody is sort of aware of metabolism and food, and they're very conscious of what they're eating and their lifestyle. But I think oftentimes, and again I say we, just referring to the royal we of our little Twitter circle, but we often just think that everyone else also has this knowledge and everybody is so aware, where I think that given the recent data coming out where a very, very slim percentage of Americans are metabolically healthy, a lot of people have zero, in probably literally zero, education in nutrition. So maybe it does take a continuous glucose monitor and a little bit of education saying high glycemic spikes, maybe above this number that lasts for this long, aren't good. Maybe it takes somebody wearing that for them to learn not to eat this food or to eat this certain food. I mean, I think that we sometimes give people too much credit, and not to say that most people are dumb, but just most people don't take as much of an interest in nutrition and food as those of us who are talking about these things on Twitter. So a CGM could be just such a valuable educational tool for them. They need that to know that exercise is good, this food is bad, etc.
I think that I would have two responses to that. One is that nobody can know exactly how foods are going to affect, and that's the whole idea of personalized glycemic variability, which we talk about in this group in our journal club, and which people can access through CGMs. So it doesn't matter if you're a Nobel laureate, you can't necessarily predict how you're going to respond to a particular food. The CGMs give you access to that answer. And the other element is, just like you said, it provides people insight in real time that could be valuable to them. If they're reporting, as we had students reporting, like, this helped me engage, it motivated me to engage in nutrition and really think about things and see that, the Coke, for example, actually, we didn't have people really eating sugar because people are pretty on a pretty good diet, but I've seen patients, for example, like, see, I actually found that this little caramel spiked my blood sugar to 300. Now, I knew the caramel wasn't good for me, but when I see that spike, that's something I can't unsee. That's a bit of data that actually motivates me. Now, you could tease that person and say, well, you should have known that in the first place. But if they're actually benefiting from that insight, then fine. What's the harm there?
Right.
And there is something valuable to having something else, be it a person or a tool, kind of like talking to you in a way about what you're doing. Maybe this is an unfair analogy, and maybe I'll get some crap for it on Twitter, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's like going into therapy and having someone talk to you about your mental processes. Could you introspect, come to the conclusions yourself, and then change your behavior? You could, but sometimes it's helpful to have outside input.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably a failed analogy in many respects, but it's what pops to mind.
It's an accountability partner in a way. It's maybe not a partner, but it holds you accountable for the things that you're doing. And it is a way ultimately to, we mentioned this, maybe it was offline, maybe it was at the very beginning, but with something like weight, you can see that. I can go to the gym every day and I can step on the scale, and I don't even have to step on the scale, but sometimes you just look in the mirror. Oh, I've gained weight, I've lost weight. How do I look? What does the scale say? That's a number that gives me immediate feedback. With something like metabolism and blood glucose, people will read things about, oh, don't eat this because it raises your blood glucose. But when you eat it, you don't see it. Unless, if you're not wearing a CGM, I don't know how anything's affecting my blood glucose. I can't see it. Maybe I feel good, maybe I feel bad. But for the most part, it's sort of a hidden metric. It's a hidden, effect on your body, because you're not necessarily seeing how this food is affecting your blood glucose. But it gives you a CGM, in that matter, gives you this immediate feedback throughout the entire day, to something that could correlate with, say, weight in the long term, because weight is, it, yes, will change on day to day, but your, percentage of fat isn't going to change from one single day to the next, whereas glucose might. And I think we have enough data to say, yes, if you have this insight and you are insulin resistant or whatever, we can tie these excursions to metabolic health, and that will correlate over the long term, maybe to weight. I know that, relationship isn't as direct as maybe I'm stating it is, but the insight gained through these can, in a way, lead someone off of the course of where they might be headed, which could not be in an ideal scenario.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I mean, as you were talking, it reminded me of something somebody told me about using their CGM. They're like, it's great. It actually calms me down from wading through all the crap on nutrition media, that confusing crap. They said, nutrition media bullshit detector.
Right.
They told me that after I posted something on Twitter about, there was a WebMD piece by a dietitian giving list of ways to lower your A1C. And one of the pieces of advice was eat grapes. And one of the cautions was don't eat macadamia nuts because of their high glycemic index.
Oh boy. Yeah. And you can run that test. You can run that test for yourself. Oh wait.
Yeah. I'm like,
this
they don't need me to
article's
tell them
bullshit
that the
because
low
it's
of
the opposite. Macadamia nuts, don't do anything to my blood glucose, whereas grapes are,
I don't know how that got online.
Yeah, I don't know how half
it does
get on there. So yeah, but no, I think that's an important point, in that just like with all of these technologies, they allow you to sort of take control over your own health, and versus rely on the media or nutrition, Twitter or social media, to tell you what to eat. If somebody recommends eat this or don't eat that because it's bad for your glucose or you're bad for your A1C, well, I don't need to guess. I can just do it. I can go and eat this, say, sweet, or this ice cream that's with, made with stevia instead of glucose. Does it spike my glucose? Oh, it doesn't. Okay, well, maybe that's okay for me to eat a little bit of that. And you can run like these tests, these n of 1 independent tests on yourself to validate or refute whatever you're hearing sort of in the media.
Yeah. One more thing I want to say about criticisms on Twitter that I just find very interesting is, given the way the environment is primed on this particular topic, any of the criticisms that are coming in, a lot of them are from RDs or even MDs. They're generally very hyperbolic. In fact, I've not seen any that weren't hyperbolic. But the interesting thing to me is that for an academician who has serious concerns, you see a publication come out, what I would do is reach out to the authors and kind of express your concerns. No one's reached out to me, even when I've offered. This has happened previously where I'm like, look, how to contact me. Somebody puts out a publication, the corresponding author is listed. You could very easily email me. We could get on a phone call. I'm happy to. But instead, twist the narrative, put up a hyperbolic or sometimes very misleading statement, or take a quote out of context and misinterpret it completely opposite of what that student actually feels. And I can tell you that because I spoke with the students. And then try to, twist it for some reason on social media. Like that's questionable to me in terms of integrity and ethics. And for the record, anybody listening to this, you can reach out to me. I'm happy to get on the phone call and hear you out very seriously. And we can talk about, concerns, but I haven't, it's kind of like a straw man, weak sauce thing to do, to try to twist things on social media without actually reaching out to the
and
team. So it's just
and something else that people can do, Nick, and this is honestly a way to advance and engage in scholarly dialogue. Write a letter to the editor. This could be a way, if people are really interested and they really feel strongly about this, as apparently some people do based on the responses, people feel strongly about this. So, okay, get yourself a publication, write a letter to the editor, and maybe start a conversation about this. Maybe they don't have issues with the methods of the paper in general, which I don't think is where kind of a lot of the criticisms were coming from. I mean, I've skimmed through the study, but the methods and things like that, I don't think that that's kind of the source of the criticism. I think the source is like, oh, is this relevant? Or, maybe they're not even criticizing the paper, but just write a letter to the editor and let's engage in a conversation about yeah, is this useful? Is this necessary? So on and so forth, whatever their criticisms may be. And, we could have a point, we could have a counterpoint article. I mean, I think that could be a fun way to engage in scholarly dialogue. And so if people are, critical of it, I would encourage them to write a letter to the editor. It wasn't my paper, so I have nothing to defend here, but they could reach out to you, but they could also, really just take this to kind of the higher levels of scholarly dialogue and write something like that. So that could be something interesting to do as well. And if they really cared about it and didn't just want to be sort of like you say, hyperbolic on social media, they could kind of really take action and draft something a little more terse and well thought out and put it in writing.
I'd love to see that happen, actually. I don't see it happening. And I'm curious what arguments would come through, because we've kind of gone through the high points. One criticism we haven't really talked about, this is the last one on the list that I'll just bring up, is the concept of if you give healthy people CGMs, then it's stealing away from people who need them.
Yes, I've heard that one as well.
I won't pretend I really understand the economics exactly of CGMs. What I will say for our project, though, is that we got CGMs that were donated from a stack that was in a clinician's office, basically just sitting there. These are not a non-renewable resource. The company can make them on demand.
Right.
We're not using insurance money to cover them, and we're not stealing them from patients. We're building patient advocates. A week into the study, I had one person come to me and was like, Nick, I just had the coolest experience in clinic. A patient came in with type 1, saw my CGM and started asking about it. He was curious. He had type 1 and he didn't want a CGM. He was nervous about them. I started showing it to him. He got very excited and now is on a CGM. So we're building patient advocates because a lot of clinicians aren't trained in this technology. You have the next generation of students finding, how this can be useful and then thinking about how it can be a lot more useful for patients because they understand the individualized responses and be like, this is interesting on me, but I now really see how it could help someone with a real metabolic need, and then, helping those people pursue and get access to CGM. So again, more broadly speaking, do I think we should be tossing CGMs out like candy to the lay public? I'm not making that argument. I never was. The paper's not making that argument. It's talking about a very particular use case. And so right now, what I'm interested in is using this for medical education, not getting it to every member of the lay public. And I think a lot of the criticisms are related to more of that. Like I said at the beginning, this kind of poked the bear on a broader topic related to CGMs. And so people are making broader hyperbolic claims that aren't really related to the paper. But then, implicitly people think of it and then there becomes this whole war. And it's actually kind of fun to watch. I find it entertaining. You can't take it too seriously.
Yeah, it is, because whenever papers and things like this come out and you see that type of criticism, I typically don't ever understand it as well, because everyone has different perspectives, but I have a hard time just seeing where people are finding the dangers or the negatives to something like this being published. I mean, you published an interesting piece of knowledge from a pilot study where you were interested in a concept and you went after that concept and explored it in this small trial with medical students, and you had some positive outcomes. They had a good experience, and overall, I mean, I see it's hard for me to see where the harm from this would come, and I honestly think that people just like picking nits about things. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just as kind of confused as you are sometimes when I see criticisms of it. Sure, if you think hard enough about it, you can think of things or reasons why the use of this technology could, not necessarily be the best, but I have a hard time finding the harm in it that people are sort of suggesting.
I don't think there really is. I again, like I said, it's kind of fun, kicks and giggles to see the criticisms. We have a group chat with some of the members in the study and also the professors. Like I said, the professors got excited, and sometimes I'll share some of the tweets and we'll just all get a good laugh.
Yeah.
Because it's just so different from the experience. Are you scared of exercise now? Person posts a selfie from the gym, is like, yeah, it's unlikely. Now I'm training for my next marathon or bodybuilding competition. It's funny.
No, for sure.
Anyway, I'm interested to see where it goes. We have a lot of people reaching out, and we're reaching out to some people about getting it scaled up. I think the next thing for me was try to do the the vertical expansion. I would love, as we move into our clerkship rotations, to have second year med students and residents and attendings come together and get a little pool of like 100 people. So we're working on IRBs for that. And I think it'll keep rolling forward. Regardless of whatever Twitter criticisms there are, they really don't affect academia. That's the thing. It's so like people are seeing this on Twitter, but what you have to bear in mind is like, I haven't heard any criticisms from the university is excited. The medical schools are excited. Everybody's like positive on this. So it's going to roll forward. So I don't really care.
Yeah. Ultimately what matters is not, like you said, not what Twitter thinks, but what the IRB thinks, what the people reviewing your grants think, and that's all that really matters. And if they find scientific merit in it, that's kind of all that matters in the long run. I do think, the whole vertical expansion thing is exciting. And going back to what you said, you mentioned earlier something about the community aspect of it. I think that's kind of a point that can, sort of be underscored where, the more people you have involved in these trials, especially if they're at the same institution, or at least if they're at institutions where they can kind of collaborate or at least chat amongst themselves, the people who are in the study, because as we can see, there are, as far as I know, a few companies right now. I know like Levels is one, but there are some others where they're like, people are sharing their data on social media where it's like, oh, look how this affects my blood glucose and look how this affects it. So it's like this collaborative effort that's kind of going on, and people are learning from others and, comparing their data and seeing what works. So that's kind of where, this can expand as well, not only in research, but then also moving to sort of public use of it. There are apps coming out. I know there's some apps that are in development or maybe in beta right now that are like, they're essentially calling it sort of like the Strava for like your health metrics. So it's just like, in someday, say I was wearing a CGM, somebody could be able to log onto my profile and see like, oh, what did Brady have for lunch? And how did that affect his glucose? Like they would look at one of my runs or bike rides on Strava or something. So that's kind of interesting as well. It's like this, metabolic metrics, metabolic fitness type of thing, which again, sure, that might be able to lead to some weird stuff down the line where people are trying to one up one another. But, anything can be, all tools can be abused if, you abuse them or put them in the wrong hands, like you mentioned many times already.
Yeah. No, it's been fun.
And, for sure.
I'm looking forward to it.
No, I am too. I'm looking forward to kind of where you go with this. And I think you have a very nice sort of, this pilot project is going to set the stage for a lot of more interesting projects in the future. So it's very exciting to see.
Yeah.
All right. So Nick, you have anything else, you want to talk about? This was kind of our main reason, but we were talking offline, maybe do you want to chat about for the next few minutes about this new paper that came out on artificial sweeteners? We're on the topic of glucose. We can stick on that. I don't know. You have a thing on your YouTube channel, but why don't we just chat about that for a few minutes?
Yeah, it was by the same group that did the 2015 paper that I brought up earlier out of the Weizmann Institute. Basically what they did was in this study take healthy young people that were naive to consuming non-nutritive sweeteners. I say non-nutritive rather than artificial because it can be no calories, but technically be natural, like stevia. Like natural. Mm-hmm. So 120 people, split them into 6 different groups. The groups were sucralose, saccharin, aspartame, and stevia, and then 2 control groups, 1 glucose and 1 just no supplement control. I had a 1-week run-in period that they were just monitoring them, then a 2-week period where they gave them whatever, their group was assigned, and then a follow-up period when then they came off again. And what they found was that there were very individualized responses to the sweeteners. So the 2 that really caused impaired, higher area under the curve on an oral glucose tolerance test. So carbohydrate intolerance were saccharin and sucralose. Those were the ones that jumped out in particular. And there were responders and non-responders. A majority of people were responders. So they had worse glycemic control when they had the sweetener at week 1. And there looked like a subtle signal that more people became responders at week 2. So it might take longer for some people to convert. That was a little subtle. I will say that in the follow-up period, people tended to revert to baseline. So it's not like, you have some sweeteners for a couple of weeks and then your microbiome shot for eternity. Right. It looked pretty reversible. So I think that's something for people to bear in mind. The paper itself is a gold mine in terms of a lot of the little nerdy nuggets throughout. That was the main finding, combined with the fact that they did confirm it was a microbiome mediated effect. And the gold standard for doing that is transplantation of the microbiomes, in this case to autobiotic mice or mice without microbiomes. You obviously can't do that to humans, but what you can do is you take the microbiomes from people before or after they have a sweetener, give it to a mouse without their own microbiome. And if the mouse adopts the metabolic profile of the person, then you know the effect is mediated by the microbiome because the mouse never got the sweetener itself.
Right.
So if you took responders before and after and then gave the samples before and after to mice, the mice that got the samples from the responders would become glucose intolerant. The mice that got the samples after from the non-responders wouldn't. So they showed it was microbiome mediated. There were a lot of details with respect to how each different sweetener would affect different pathways within the microbiome. That gets a little complicated. One very interesting tidbit that jumped out at me, and I'm not really sure how to interpret it. I think it was in figure 4F. They were looking at profiles of people that might predict being a responder or a non-responder. They were looking at sucralose in particular, and they found that at baseline, there were higher ketone levels in the non-responders to sucralose and lower in the responders, and that the effects of the sucralose were opposite. So in the responders, the ketones went up, and in the non-responders who had higher levels of baseline, they went down. I don't know what to make of that, but I actually found it interesting because it makes me think about, how could somebody's baseline diet affect the response? Could say somebody on a ketogenic diet that has something with sucralose like keto chow might be more likely to be a non-responder. Obviously, that's going beyond the paper, but it's like they were looking at different things that might predict responder, non-responder. And that was just one because obviously anytime I see beta hydroxybutyrate, it jumps out to me. That was like, interesting. So people can comb through the paper, but those are the high points. People on social are going to be probably saying like, now there's proof that sweeteners are bad for the microbiome. I didn't read it like that per se. For example, in 2 weeks, there weren't any changes in like BMI or body comp or blood pressure. So again, we're back to like tools that have upsides and downsides, and you can use them as you will. Will I have a keto chow every now and then? Like, fine. I'm not that concerned. I don't wake up the next day and like I've lost my 6-pack. I have high blood pressure. Like, it is what it is. So it's interesting, and there definitely are non-responders. So there's that.
No, it's very interesting. And yeah, I'll have to read the paper more in depth, and I will link your YouTube video for people who are interested. But kind of the main thing that it just gets me thinking about is, as you mentioned, maybe the applications of these short-term impairments of glucose tolerance maybe it's not necessarily that like relevant. I guess my thinking is like, well, maybe, I don't know. They started eating these artificial sweeteners. Maybe before they started eating these artificial sweeteners, the people were eating, maybe the artificial sweeteners caused them to lower the carbohydrate content of their diet a bit. Was that?
No, they tracked in real time over the course of the study, and they were controlled between groups.
Okay, because my main thought would be if they lower the carbohydrate content of the diet, because this has been shown with like ketogenic diets and low carb diets. If you're on a low carb diet for enough time, your insulin or carbohydrate tolerance could go down, actually, kind of paradoxically to what somebody might think. Oh, you're going to improve your insulin resistance with low carb or keto. Sometimes it can go down, which makes sense when you think about it. If you're not eating carbohydrates, kind of doesn't have to be a lot, but if you're not eating carbohydrates, maybe your tolerance or your ability to metabolize those carbohydrates goes down. So that was my initial thought. Like, if they're eating less carbs and they're replacing them with these non-nutritive sweeteners, perhaps that's going to lower their carbohydrate tolerance. But
it was table S3, I think. They said, I was just skimming through the paper. There were no significant differences in nutrient, carbohydrate, sugar, fiber, protein, fat, and cholesterol intake or physical activity between the groups, including the control groups, table S3. So
cool. I should have figured that they thought about that. So that's good. That's good to hear.
A lot of people wouldn't. The Elenov and Segal group, at the Weitzman, they do some stellar work. I don't know how they have like multiple papers a year in like Cell and Nature. It's crazy. They do some pretty incredible work, and they're good papers. It's not like one of those things. Sometimes you have groups that like can slide a paper into Nature because they have some connections, but you're like, this methodology is shoddy. They do good work. they have a lot of cool stuff.
Cool. Well, yeah, anyway, we were just chatting about that offline. So I wanted to chat about it, a study that people will be interested in kind of seeing, but I'll refer them more to your YouTube video where you kind of break that down a little bit more in depth. And we will link all the papers we talked about today, kind of the artificial sweeteners one, the one on CGM, and then maybe the personalized nutrition one. I'll try to link all those in the show notes, but I'm sure people as well, if they don't have access to the full text, they could reach out to you, reach out to me if they want to read the CGM paper. So
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm really passionate about open access. This one, I had a back and forth with the journal about it. It's $3,500. I don't have grant money. The school's not going to support it. They're not going to give me any discount. So it's like, I just right now I can't do that. Somebody wants to give me $3,500, I'll pass it on. But
right.
Yeah, it's only my second paper out of like 25 that haven't been open access. So I'm really sorry about that. If you find a way to DM me or email me, I can send you the PDF. I'm happy to do that. But I just don't have $100 to like shell out right now. So sorry.
No, yeah, that's academic publishing. That's a whole nother issue to chat about.
That's a steep one.
Yeah.
So anyway,
cool.
It is
all right, Nick. Well, thanks a lot for taking some time again to chat today. I learned a lot just from the YouTube videos, but then just speaking with you today, I'm very interested in this project, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm excited to see where it goes. I think that your future studies that you're designing in this area will be fascinating, and I'm excited to learn more. So before we hop off, can you just tell people where to find you if they want to say hey on social media or get involved in the conversation?
Yeah, I'm at Nick Norwitz on Twitter. I'm sure the conversation around CGMs will continue to be the main thing that I'm tweeting about for the next little while. So there's that. I think the CGM study tweet is my pinned tweet at the moment. And yeah, I'd love to hear people's thoughts. Feel free to reach out. I can't promise to reply to everything, but at Nick Norwitz on Twitter, and that's probably where I'm most active at the moment. So yeah, thanks for the time.
All right. Yeah, no problem, Nick. Thanks for coming on, and have a great rest of the day.
You too.
All right.